I used to think my daughter's wedding would be the last quiet day of my life, until the videographer called and said, "Judge Sterling, you need to see this. Nobody should have to." A moment later, the screen lit up, and there he was, my son-in-law, doing something I could hardly believe, something he did just half an hour before Sarah walked down the aisle. Right then, I knew everything had been wrong from the start. But before I go on, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. That afternoon, the Hamptons were covered in a soft golden glow. I was sitting in my reading room holding my cup of herbal tea, same routine, same quiet, when the phone buzzed. On the screen was a familiar name, Jake Pace-Miller, the kid I trusted with every family event, more than 10 years with us. Never a problem, always professional, always respectful of boundaries. But his voice that day, something was off. A hesitation, a worry he didn't even know how to name. "Judge Sterling, this is a little sensitive," he said, breathing like he'd just run. "But I think you need to know before anyone else sees it." 40 years on the bench trained my spine to straighten the second I heard a tone like that. "Go ahead. I'm not trying to pry into anyone's private life, but I figured if I were a father, I wouldn't want this landing in the hands of the media." I still didn't understand. I'm not the type to flinch at vague warnings, but something in his voice made my heart sink word by word. "Pace, tell me, right now." He sent a short clip. I remember the sound, the little ding when the file landed. Small thing. But later it felt like the gate swinging open for a storm, aimed straight at my family. I opened the clip, and in the first 2 seconds the last bit of calm in me shattered. Robert, my soon-to-be son-in-law, was standing in the wine room. Low lighting, just enough to blur, but not enough to hide his face. And right in front of the lens, he was kissing a young woman I had never seen before, kissing her like the night belonged to them. A kiss that wasn't a mistake. It was practiced, lingering. The kind shared by people who've done it far too many times. I glanced at the timestamp in the corner. 5:05 in the afternoon. The wedding started at 5:30. I don't remember when I set the tea down. Don't remember how my breath faltered. I just remember my left hand clenching so tight the knuckles went white. Part of me wanted to shut the video off. The other part, the cold part, the judge who spent a lifetime watching people's sins unfold, forced me to watch every second. When the clip ended, the reading room felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out. "You saw it?" Pace asked, his voice small, like he was afraid I'd break apart right there. It took me a few seconds to answer. "How much did you record?" "Only that." I almost deleted it, but something felt wrong. And the woman, she looked familiar. Maybe staff. I closed my eyes, felt a cold line crawl down my spine. Not because he cheated, but because it was too easy, too reckless, too exposed. And my future son-in-law is not a stupid man. "Besides me," I asked, "has anyone else seen it?" "No, sir." I called as soon as I found it. "Keep it quiet. Tell no one. I'll take it from here." I don't know if he heard the anger I was trying to cage inside my voice, but he answered fast, "Yes, sir." I hung up. The whole estate went silent. So quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock like it was counting down to something. I stepped onto the balcony, looking out at the garden where the wedding had taken place 3 weeks earlier, where Sarah, my daughter, smiled like a kid believing she was stepping into a new life, where I blessed her with everything a father could give. And I had stood there, completely unaware that 30 minutes before the ceremony, her brand new husband was whispering sweetness to another woman inside my own house. But the thing that crushed my chest wasn't the betrayal. It was the question whispering in my mind. Why would Robert risk something like this on the biggest day of his life? And why, in my wine room, no one is that careless unless they feel safe. Or they think I'll never find out. That was the moment I realized this wasn't romance, wasn't weakness, wasn't some young man's mistake. It had purpose. And if it had purpose, then that clip was only the beginning. I went back to the reading room, sat down, and played the video again. This time not as a father, but as a judge trained to see the details everyone else misses. When Robert's face appeared under that warm light, one truth settled in my chest I had to investigate. Not for revenge, But to understand what kind of life my daughter had walked into, I had no idea. The answer would be even more brutal than that video. I replayed that clip 3 more times, until Robert's face in that dim light felt like a confession etched in stone. But by then, my anger as a father had slipped to the side. 4 decades on the bench had kicked in hard. A careless act can be forgiven, but a reckless one, repeated, on the damn wedding day, usually hides a motive. And if the motive touched this marriage, it could only be for one thing: money or access to family assets. I don't know how long I sat there in the fading light of the reading room. But when I finally stood, my mind had already lined up a chain of questions I'd brushed off before, now forming something dark, something ugly. Robert had been too eager with Sarah, too present at every family meeting, too invested in shared financial futures. And lately, way too pushy about that post-nuptial agreement I never got to read. Back then, Sarah told me, "It's just paperwork, Dad. We want to be transparent." I didn't push further. I didn't want more cracks in a father-daughter relationship already worn thin. She'd always felt I controlled her, that I never let her steer her own life. So I stepped back, gave her space. Maybe that step back kept me from seeing a storm building under my own roof. That night when the clip finally went black on the screen, I called someone I never thought I'd need for something like this, Alan Pierce. Old friend from my Supreme Court days, now an independent legal consultant on messy financial investigations. Alan didn't ask much. He just said, "Arthur, send me what you've got. I'll run his entire financial history within 48 hours. I sent everything: Robert's marriage paperwork, some odd transactions I overheard from Andrew, and a handful of wedding documents I'd kept out of old habit. 2 days later, Alan called. "Arthur, you want the bad news first or the worse?" I exhaled. "Go ahead. Robert's drowning in debt, but that's not the real danger. His debts tie back to a high-end real estate investment group, which is actually a circular scam. If he doesn't get out soon, he'll be dragged into a chain of lawsuits." I leaned back. My chest tightened like someone had their hand around it. "And the worst part?" I asked. Alan paused. A long, heavy pause. He never hesitated unless the truth was brutal. His main target wasn't Sarah's dowry. He's after the Sterling estate. My hands curled into fists. That estate belongs to the family. No one has the right, I know. But there's another way he could get near it: through managerial rights if Sarah signed certain postmarital agreements. I froze. Sarah's words flashed back. "It's just formalities, Dad." The floor felt like it shifted beneath me. "Alan, you think Sarah knew anything?" Silence. I heard him breathe slow, careful. Alan doesn't stall unless it hurts to say. "I'm afraid she did." My voice cracked. "No. Sarah, wouldn't I? Checked her secondary account. She transferred a significant amount to Robert 3 months ago, right when his group was collapsing. Every cell in me went cold." Alan continued, voice low. "She also signed temporary authorization documents. Not enough for him to seize the estate outright, but enough to give him leverage in future agreements." I had no words left. Everything he said felt distant, like echoes in a long tunnel. I stood, walked to the window, looked out at the garden where Sarah used to run when she was little. That child once believed I could fix anything. And now, she was helping put our family in danger. Not for love, but to escape my shadow. I don't know how long I stood there. When Alan gently said "Arthur," my throat felt dry, raw. "Send me everything," I said. "All the documents." "What are you planning to do?" I stared at my reflection in the glass. An old man who spent his whole life protecting the law, yet couldn't protect his own family. "I'm going to investigate," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. But this time, not as a judge. The moment I hung up, the thought sank in deep. If Robert's actions were just the surface, then underneath there had to be a bigger plan, and Sarah had stepped right into it. And I couldn't let them keep going, because betrayal I can tolerate. But a scheme aimed at the family legacy, the legacy I spent my whole life building, that I will not allow. Right then, I understood exactly what lay ahead, a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight, a battle against my own daughter. I've sat through more hearings than I can count, staring at people who hid their sins behind polished manners. I'd watched families crumble over a single word: greed. But I never thought I'd face that same fear in my own home, with my own daughter and the man she chose. After that last call with Alan, I stayed frozen in the reading room. The whole house felt like it was holding its breath. Every corner where Sarah once played now stood like silent witnesses, turning their backs on me. And in that silence, I understood something painful. It was time to stop being the wounded father and become the man people respected and feared in equal measure. Arthur Sterling, retired Supreme Court judge, a man who never lost his edge. I opened the safe in my reading room where I kept the most guarded documents of my life. Not trophies, shields, insurance from the darker years of politics. Inside was a black folder marked Veto Plan, a contingency I'd built long ago, in case anyone ever tried to strike at my family's reputation or assets during vulnerable times. I never imagined I'd use it because of my own daughter. When I placed that folder on the desk, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from bitterness. I was about to use a weapon I'd created to protect the very values Sarah was helping tear down. I flipped through the pages. This wasn't revenge. It was a legal machine, complex procedures tied to special authorities I'd been granted on the bench, tools that could freeze assets, stall major financial transfers, and summon individuals into emergency hearings. No one knew about them except me, and a few trusted lawyers. Just then my phone buzzed. The name lit up the screen, Andrew Sterling, my eldest. The boy who'd borrowed money from me so many times, I stopped keeping track. A good kid, but weak, bendable. I almost ignored the call, but something told me to pick up. "Dad!" Andrew's voice shook. "I need to tell you something, but please, don't get mad." My heart sank. "Say it." He took a shaky breath. I gave Robert some things. I thought he needed them for paperwork. I didn't realize how serious this is." I straightened. "What did you give him?" The silence on the line told me everything. "Andrew, some access codes and your signature samples." For a moment I felt nothing. His words hit the floor like pieces of shattered glass. "What did you get in return?" My voice came out, calm, too calm. "Just," he whispered, "a small payment. He said it was only to verify some files." "I didn't think it's not your fault," I cut in. Not out of forgiveness, but because I knew he wasn't smart enough to realize he was being used. And the moment those words left my mouth, a harder truth struck me. The betrayal in my family didn't come from one direction. It came from all three. Sarah, trying to escape my shadow. Robert, driven by greed. Andrew, too weak to stand his ground. And me, the one who created a world where they thought deception was a way out. I couldn't let myself drown in that thought. Not now. I needed to act. "Andrew," I said, "from this moment forward, no contact with Robert. No signatures, no information, nothing. Understood? Yes, Dad." I hung up without another word. Not out of anger, but because the calculations had already begun. My whole life, reason guided my decisions. Tonight I had to use it to protect what I'd neglected, the safety of this family. I opened my personal computer and logged into a secured system only one other person in the Justice Department knew existed. 3 minutes later, the veto plan was officially activated. A hidden chain of commands rippled into every financial stream tied to the Sterling name. Within 48 hours, every major transaction would freeze. Within 72, every asset linked to Sarah and Robert would be audited. Within 96, an emergency summons would be sent directly to them. I knew what that meant. I'd just opened a full-scale war. But if they wanted to drag me into the dark, I'd drag the light back, even if it blinded every last one of us. When the system flashed activation complete, I leaned back, drawing a long breath. But it didn't bring relief. It brought loneliness, the kind that seeps into your bones. I'd never felt so isolated, never felt so cold, never seen so clearly that I had only one path left, the path of a man accustomed to confronting guilt. Only this time the guilt belonged to those who carried my name. I don't know what this war will cost me. My reputation, my family, whatever's still beating in my chest, but I know this, I'm going to see it through. Because when justice is cornered, it becomes the sharpest weapon of all, even when it has to cut into your own blood. The next few days passed in a silence so dense it felt alive. No one in the family knew that every transaction they thought they controlled had already been frozen, caught in an old legal mechanism I guarded like a final confession. Robert kept making those long, frantic phone calls with his lawyers. Sarah still smiled in public, pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath her feet. But I could see it, the flicker of panic each time a transfer failed. I didn't wait for them to figure it out. Instead, I chose to drag everything into the open, into a space where no one could hide. I called it a family tribunal, not in a courthouse. Here in my home, the place where every secret was born and where my authority still carried weight. That evening, I invited former prosecutors, trusted journalists, and a few legal minds I'd known for decades. The invitation read, "A special family dinner." Sarah and Robert arrived, smiling, unaware of the storm, sitting in the center of the room, a large screen lights arranged so that the truth had nowhere else to go. When the appetizers were served, I stood. "Before this dinner ends, I want everyone to see something." Robert narrowed his eyes. Sarah tensed. I pressed a button. Robert's affair lit up the screen. Shock swept through the room. Robert tried to hide his face too slow. Sarah turned pale. I didn't pause. I moved to the financial records, the authorization forms, the links to the fraudulent organization they'd tangled themselves with. Everything was laid out cleanly, clinically, just like the courtroom I once presided over. And this, I said, is the most important part. I placed the veto plan folder on the table and explained how their assets had been legally frozen. My voice stayed cold. For the first time, they understood that whatever power they thought they wielded had always been borrowed, and now it was gone. But the real blow wasn't the evidence. It wasn't the legal authority. It was what I said next. I've also decided to relinquish my lifetime position as Supreme Court Justice. I will use the entirety of my pension to establish a free legal aid foundation for the poor, for the unheard. The room went still. Robert opened his mouth, but I cut him off. No one here needs to fear the law, but everyone must face the consequences of their choices. Sarah lowered her head. Robert looked like a man realizing he'd just lost the last thing he could bargain with: perception. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The authority I had spent a lifetime building silent, sharp, spoke for me. I watched them, the fear in their eyes, the clumsy gestures of guilt, and I knew finally they were seeing the truth they'd spent years avoiding. And yet, I felt no joy. This wasn't revenge, and it wasn't triumph. It was protection of justice, of principles, of the very foundation they had tried to compromise. Sacrificing title and privilege didn't weaken me. It clarified me. When dinner ended, Sarah and Robert stood there quiet, aware that every step they took now existed in the shadow of what I had put in motion. I said nothing more. Real power doesn't need an encore. As I sat back and watched Sarah avert her eyes and Robert stare into nothing, I felt something shift. The anger was gone. The hurt had quieted. What remained was the cold certainty of a man who knows the law, knows himself, and knows precisely what must happen next. The climax hadn't arrived. It was only gathering. The final reckoning of legacy, of justice, of the sterling name was still waiting on the horizon. After the night of the family tribunal, the house felt different. Not because anyone left, but because the truth, heavy and inescapable, had forced everyone to look inward. But I knew that dinner was only the first doorway. To truly finish this, to protect the legacy I spent a lifetime building, I would need one final act, one none of them could foresee. The next morning, I sat alone in my study looking through the tall glass window at a city waking under the sun. I'd lived here more than half a century. I'd watched streets change, people rise and vanish. But one thing had never changed: my responsibility to justice. And as I looked back at what my family had become, I knew my last journey would be to redefine that responsibility. I called Sarah in. She walked with a heaviness I hadn't seen before, still struggling to make sense of everything she'd faced the night before. But unlike Robert, she didn't look away. She held my gaze, shaken but honest. And in that honesty, I finally saw what I had missed for years: the quiet wounds of a child raised in a powerful home with too little warmth. "About last night," she began, but I raised a hand. "No explanations," I said. "What matters isn't what happened. What matters is what you choose to do now." Her eyes reddened. For the first time, she wasn't defiant or proud or guarded. She was simply someone facing her own mistakes. "I want to make things right," she said. "And I want to start with this family." I nodded. "Then you'll have that chance." We spent the entire morning reviewing the Sterling estate from real properties to companies, charities, frozen authorizations. Sarah focused, asked the right questions, listened instead of assuming. And the longer I watched her, the clearer it became she wasn't irresponsible. She had simply been shaped in the wrong environment beside a husband who encouraged the worst parts of her. By noon, I led her to the archives, where the core of the Sterling legacy was kept. Rows of steel cabinets. Files labeled by hand across decades. I opened the lowest drawer and pulled out an old wooden box. Inside was the revised will, one I had never released. "Do you know why I waited until now to open this?" I asked. She shook her head. "Because I wanted to see who in this family had the courage to face their mistakes and rise." I placed the will in her hands. "This is the final distribution of our estate. I don't hand power to someone who only knows how to enjoy it. I give it to someone who respects the worth of every dollar this family bled for." Her hands trembled as she opened it. When she reached her own name, her eyes filled not with ambition but disbelief. I don't deserve this." "No one deserves anything immediately," I said. "You become deserving by choosing to change." That afternoon I sent a letter to Robert. No anger, no accusations. Just one line: "From this day on, you no longer hold any authority or claim over the Sterling estate. But the door to becoming a decent man is still open if you choose it." It wasn't that I had stopped being angry, but anger couldn't be what ended this family's story. When night fell, the mansion glowed softly. Sarah stood beside me on the terrace, the city wind carrying its familiar chill. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "I know I've done so many things wrong, but if you'll allow me, I want to be someone, Mom, and you could be proud of." I looked at her and felt something I hadn't felt in years: trust. And in that moment I understood that my greatest legacy wasn't money, companies, or property. It was the capacity for someone to grow, to correct themselves when every door feels closed. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we start tomorrow. A Sterling doesn't need to be perfect. A Sterling needs to be honest." As I looked over the city, I realized my final journey wasn't about crushing conflict. It was about building a future where mistakes weren't buried, they were used to make better people. And so under the reflections of city lights across the glass towers, I knew the story had closed the way it should. Not with ruin, not with punishment, but with the rebirth of a family that once seemed beyond saving. That was my true victory, a legacy that no one could steal.